Water is the most important molecule for life on Earth. When water or evidence of water is found in outer space, scientists lose their minds. Let's find out why water is so special with video 5.2 on the properties of water. We are hitting these two objectives hard, so press that pause button softly to check them out. Now, the last video talked about how water is a polar molecule, which means there's a positive pole on this hydrogen side and a negative pole to a water molecule. Water is polar because these chemical bonds are polar covalent bonds where oxygen dominates the electron sharing and keeps those valence electrons closer to itself than hydrogen does. As a result of being a polar molecule, hydrogen can do a cool trick called hydrogen bonding, where the partial negative charge oxygen of one water molecule forms a tiny attraction to the partial positive charge of a hydrogen atom on a neighboring water molecule. So those last two slides, worth a double take. We can call the polar covalent bonds within a water molecule intramolecular bonds. Like all covalent bonds, water's polar covalent bonds are strong. To break 1 mole of these intramolecular polar covalent bonds requires about 460 kilojoules of energy. In contrast, those hydrogen bonds between water molecules are intermolecular bonds. Hydrogen bonds are shown in diagrams, and these diagrams in almost every diagram as dotted lines, and think about it as an indication that hydrogen bonds are not as solid and strong as covalent bonds. In water, hydrogen bonds are about 50 times weaker than the polar covalent bonds. In other words, it's relatively easy to separate water molecules from each other, but it's pretty hard to break apart an individual water molecule. Now, that may seem like no big deal, but those hydrogen bonds give water molecules 4 incredible superpowers, and this is the most superpower picture I could find. These 4 superpowers of water are cohesion and adhesion, and water is considered the universal solvent. Water has a lower density as solid ice compared to liquid water, and fourth, water has a high specific heat. Now, let's unpack each of those. The first emergent property of water is cohesion and adhesion. So, cohesion describes how water molecules stick to other water molecules. As a result of cohesion, water has a surface tension or a skin. So here are those hydrogen bonds between water molecules on the surface that gives us surface tension. And that surface tension or skin, you can see it on water droplets. You can see it on the surface of a body of water. And because cohesion and surface tension result from hydrogen bonding, this force is going to be relatively weak because hydrogen bonding is weak. But it's still going to be strong enough for tiny little bugs like these water striders to actually walk on water's surface. The other part of this is adhesion, where water molecules stick to other molecules, but not just any molecule. Water molecules adhere to other charged or polar surfaces because water will form hydrogen bonds with these charges. And you've actually experienced adhesion today. So you can go in the bathroom and wash your hands and dry your hands with a paper towel because of the adhesion between the water molecules and the paper towel. When water is drawn away by the paper towel, this is actually called capillary action. And another example of adhesion is where we measure water in a glass graduated cylinder. So the water molecules actually adhere to the glass and start to climb the walls of the graduated cylinders. In the end, though, gravity wins and pulls the water down in the middle and makes this little depression. And overall, this forms this meniscus shape in your graduated cylinder. But let's get into a biologically relevant example of this. So biologically, cohesion and adhesion come in for the water cycle, among other things. So remember how plants take water from the soil using their roots, and then that water passes through the plants and evaporates from the leaves into the atmosphere, and that's called transpiration. So transpiration totally relies on cohesion and adhesion. To better understand this, we need to zoom in and hit a couple of terms here. So plants have a series of tubes inside of them. So we're zooming in here to this tree trunk, and that series of tubes is called a xylem. So you see a bunch of xylem lined up next to each other, kind of like straws in a plant. And if you look into one of these xylem tubes, you'll see some hydrogen bonding happen, indicated by these dotted lines. So hydrogen bonding between water molecules, we know, is called cohesion. And in transpiration, water molecules use cohesion to pull the next water molecule up the plant. You can also see hydrogen bonds between water molecules and the charged xylem wall or cell wall here. And in this process of transpiration, adhesion allows water molecules to stick to the xylem wall and climb up the plant before eventually evaporating out into the atmosphere. Water is also referred to sometimes as the universal solvent, but let's tone that down a little bit and call water a good solvent instead. Universal makes us think that water can dissolve anything. You know what? Actually, hold on a sec. Now is probably a good time to review some key chemistry terms, just in case. All right, let's check out this example of salt water. In salt water, water is the solvent, and water dissolves the solute of salt. Together, the solvent and the solute make up the solution of salt water. All right, so what does it mean that water is a good solvent? Well, water is just a good dissolver of stuff. As good as water is at dissolving, I told you that water isn't a universal solvent because water can't dissolve everything. Water, though, is great at dissolving polar and ionic solutes. Non-polar or uncharged solutes, not so much. And this gets us back to our basic chemistry rule of like dissolves like. So how water dissolves polar and ionic solutes is by forming a hydration sphere around these solutes. So you can see two hydration spheres here. So this model, let's back it up a second. This model actually shows salt with negative chloride ions and positive sodium ions in a whole bunch of water. So you see all these water molecules around here. And water molecules completely surround the individual ions in a hydration sphere or hydration shell. And once these ions are isolated from each other, and you can't see them in the water, and they seem to disappear. And this is the dissolving process. So these ions are still there, and you just can't see them. So another thing I want you to notice in this model is how water molecules orient their positively charged hydrogens towards the negative solute, the negative ion of chloride, and how water will orient in the opposite way with its negatively charged oxygens pointed towards a positively charged solute. So because water is polar, water can form these attractions and dissolve polar or charged solutes. And that's why these solutes are called hydrophilic. But again, water is not a universal solvent because water can't dissolve nonpolar or uncharged substances. These substances are also called hydrophobic substances. That's really important, so I want to stress that again. So ionic and charged molecules are hydrophilic. Think about those words as somewhat interchangeable. On the other hand, nonpolar or uncharged molecules are hydrophobic, and you can think about those words as somewhat interchangeable or at least related. As for a biologically relevant example, look no further than the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycles. Water's solvent properties are huge for these cycles. Remember how plants take up nitrates from the soil through their roots and how plants take up phosphates from the soil through their roots? Well, let's check out the chemical formulas for these. Nitrates, NO3 minus, phosphates, PO4 minus 3. Well, plants can take up these nutrients because of these charges. These charges make nitrates and phosphates hydrophilic, and hopefully you can imagine water molecules forming a solvent shell with their positively charged hydrogens pointed in and forming that shell around nitrates and phosphates, so that when plants take water into their roots, they're also taking nitrates and phosphates with it. The next emergent property of water is that ice is less dense than liquid water. In other words, ice floats. And when you have a glass of water, you see the ice cubes floating on top. Well, there's a molecular reason for this, and without getting too deep into it, we know that water molecules form hydrogen bonds with other water molecules, right? It's cohesion. Well, one water molecule can actually form hydrogen bonds with up to 4 other water molecules. And when that happens, water molecules form this perfect structure called a lattice. It's a crystal, right? Like ice crystals. But when the temperatures are a little bit warmer, these water molecules start moving around faster. And since these hydrogen bonds are so weak, individual hydrogen bonds are made and broken very quickly. And as a result, water is usually only forming like 3 or 3.5 hydrogen bonds instead of the full 4 when water is a liquid. What does this have to do with anything? Well, when water is in its ice crystal structure, look how far apart these water molecules are spread out. And since the water molecules are spread out, they take up more space and expand, or they have less density. But in liquid form, the water molecules are less spread out. They have less density. And this property of a solid state being less dense than a liquid state is hugely rare in the chemical world. It's a big deal. So what does that have to do with biology instead of just chemistry? Well, large bodies of water actually don't freeze because ice floats on top. Let me explain how this works. So when it gets really cold, so this is showing it's really cold, it's minus 20, and we're minus 20 Celsius, not minus 20 Fahrenheit here. So when it gets really cold and some water starts to freeze into ice, that ice will float on top. And even when this air temperature is so cold, the layer of ice on top of the lake or ocean creates this insulating layer. And the ice layer can get thicker, but it's usually going to prevent the water below from completely freezing. This water temperature is still 4 degrees. And so as a result, organisms can live below the water surface and survive the winter. Because if an organism completely freezes, it has a really low chance of survival. Now, if the ice actually sunk in the liquid water, the whole lake would end up freezing from the bottom up, and everything would die, and the whole lake would have to reset every year when the temperatures got warmer. The last emergent property of water is that water has an unusually high specific heat. Specific heat is the amount of energy it takes to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of any substance by 1 degree Celsius. And this property is different from substance to substance, as you can see in the table down here. So you can see that water has a high specific heat compared to these other substances. All right, so what does that mean? So what that means is it takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature of water. So this is why, like, when you boil water in a pot to make some rice or some macaroni or something, the metal of the pot, which has a low specific heat, heats up way faster than the water in the pot, which has a high specific heat. Another way to say all of this is that water resists temperature changes. And we see this all the time by living near Lake Michigan. So when the temperature gets hot inland, and you watch the weather on the news, they say it's cooler by the lake. And that's because water is absorbing a lot of that heat without the water changing temperature as much as the air. And in contrast, if the temperature suddenly gets cooler inland, then it's warmer by the lake because the lake is resisting letting go of its heat to the atmosphere. So in this way, since Earth has so much water on it, water can act as a temperature buffer for our planet. So because of water's high specific heat, the temperature of bodies of water stay relatively stable. And that's good for our planet, and it's good for the temperature of those bodies of water and the organisms that live in the bodies of water. And also because we and other organisms are made up largely of water, our temperatures can stay stable too. So if it's freezing cold outside, and let's say you're going outside to wait for the bus, you can walk outside and you're not like immediately going to freeze right away because the water in your body resists that temperature change. All right, so let's recap. We've been on a whirlwind tour of water here. So this video re-emphasized the fact that water is a polar molecule because of the polar covalent intramolecular bonds within a water molecule. Because water molecules are polar, water molecules can form intermolecular hydrogen bonds with other water molecules. And 4 properties of water emerge from the fact that water can form these hydrogen bonds. First, cohesion is when water molecules hydrogen bond with each other, and adhesion is when water molecules hydrogen bond with non-water molecules. Cohesion and adhesion are hugely important for transpiration. Water is a really good solvent because the polar sides of water can form solvent shells and dissolve polar or charged solutes. Next, water is less dense as solid ice than liquid water, allowing an insulating layer of ice to form on the tops of the bodies of water, so the bodies of water don't freeze. And finally, water has a high specific heat, allowing water to be a good temperature buffer and stabilize the temperatures of organisms, stabilize the temperature of bodies of water, and stabilize the temperature of our planet.